Here's the circle strafe, the bread and butter for movement in video games. Players these days jiggle around their joysticks and movement keys in full degrees in order to evade even the most simple attacks and traps. Quick dexterity and spatial awareness is almost as important as the ability to quickly put down anything in between you and your weapon of choice. These days, it might be the gun attached to your main in a hero shooter like Overwatch or Marvel Rivals, but back then it was the shotgun versus the hordes of Hell in Doom. Doom popularized this style of game, this style of movement. Hell, it even popularized the standard loadout of weapons most games to this day still implement. A pistol, a shotgun, an even bigger shotgun, a rifle, an even bigger rifle, and an explosive weapon. Doom is the milestone, but what about all of the other steps id Software had to take in order to get here? While video games are so much more than Doom, I find the unraveling of id Software's mystique and rockstar lifestyle more appealing than the stories of most shooter development teams. Including every blinding success and every backward tumble, id Software's story is both inspiring and damning, warning of a video games industry hell-bent on perfection and emotional sacrifice. But things were never perfect, and this is never more emblematic than with id's earlier years, before the company broke the minds of the mainstream, struggling to find their footing, and struggling even further with design and motivation when they did. Looking backward into some of id's other IP before Doom, before acquiring Silas Warner's blessing on Wolfenstein, it's clear that it has had ambitions to bring fast-paced gaming to the forefront of the public's mind. Their first game that included the innovative strafe of the future would be the Apple II program Catacomb, the brainchild of id co-founder John Carmack. Carmack notoriously swears up and down that he doesn't see the mechanical attributes of a game nearly as important to his own technical attributes. In an old .plan file posted to the internet, sourced from the David Kushner book Masters of Doom, Carmack states, quote, "For me, while I do take a lot of pride in shipping a great product, the achievements along the way are more memorable. I don't remember any of our older product releases, but I remember the important insights. Knowledge builds on knowledge. I wind up categorizing periods of my life by how rich my learning experiences were at the time." Unquote. However, I want to refute that by including that this game is the birth of id's own principles for game design going forward. I just find it so charming that it came from the guy who we would least expect it from. Action games and shooters are so ingrained into our cultural zeitgeist that it's hard to tell where the first idea showed up. Trying to pinpoint an exact moment as to where this imprinted knowledge originally sprung up pre-id is like an uphill battle. The action games, as we know it, were defined by a multitude of different vibes and visions throughout the early years of the medium. Yes, Doom popularized the first-person perspective, but what about all of the minutiae? Did it start in 1961 when the military flick Guns of Navarone broke through to a younger Silas Warner, who would use it as the basis of his 1981 project Castle Wolfenstein? How about the 1970s, when games started becoming much more about destruction over competition, with releases like Asteroids and Death Race hitting the mainstream hard, shifting the direction of games to a much more violent nature? Hell, 1985 saw the release of Gauntlet, a quarter-eater based around crawling through dungeons against hordes of the best nightmarish creatures that Atari could render at the time. Though that last one seems to have the biggest impact on the most important work of Carmack, as he hacked and whacked the vicious multiplayer game into a rather primitive single-player program. Carmack sought to make a dungeon crawler for the PC audience with a similar structure and premise to the arcade hit. Gauntlet is heavily inspired by the adventures that Ed Logg would watch his son take up in Dungeons & Dragons. Similarly, Carmack would use his own D&D experiences to muster up a tailor-made, brutal fantasy experience. Although that's much easier said than done. The home computer isn't exactly a coin-operated machine. Attempting to slot quarters into a random hole or vent can end pretty badly for anyone expecting the same exact arcade action engendered by Atari. Carmack would need to work around a different breed of mean for Catacomb and its sequel. The result is cute, programmer art-hashed versions of Gauntlet that trade the hordes and quarter-eating for obtuse secrets, quick saving, and strict level design. Catacomb is ugly, utilitarian, and oftentimes dry within its humor and presentation. Within reason, the most Carmack could squeeze out of this game is standard geometry alongside bold signposting that tries its hardest to paint a picture of a more concrete environment. Words like clearing, palace, or pyramid litter themselves across blocks, asking you to suspend your disbelief and try to envision a world that isn't hampered by the EGA and CGA color limits. It's absolutely adorable to see PC gaming in its most youthful state, and Carmack and company take full advantage of this. When tasked with directing the sequel, Tom Hall ended up inserting his trademark dry humor into anything he could. This is a game that has you walk up to a square full of goblins named Goblin Den, and all you can really say is, "Yep, that's a goblin den, alright." Catacomb's depiction of heaven has a cloud simply named Kevin Cloud, in reference to future id artist, Kevin Cloud. The circles of hell are flush with the living damned, with jokes poking and prodding at the idea of rebels like himself going to hell for messing with the sanctity of computers, and jabs at the avaricious entrepreneurs of the time, such as Donald J. Trump. Oh, how topical. Soft disk influence can be felt tenfold by all the little tricks and traps the game uses in order to provide a fierce challenge. Even with its ease of combat, Catacomb can be downright mean sometimes, hiding key items behind secret walls, using teleporters to drastically disorient players, and sticking high-level enemies on unsuspecting players. Secret hunting provides the player with a handsome reward, another id staple going forward. The reason I bring up Catacomb instead of something like Dangerous Dave or Commander Keen is entirely because of the way this game frames combat. Instead of a full 2-dimensional 90-degree plane, Catacomb operates on Gauntlet's flat 360-degree world space. Unlike Gauntlet's free range of motion, Catacomb is stuck operating on simple X and Y axes for its combat, making it very clear that the standard way of damaging enemies is to position yourself, stand your ground, and shoot in front of you, while trying to strafe away from the deadly projectiles when given the chance, almost akin to the design philosophies of the studio going forward. Grandiose palaces, castles, and moon bases, littered with enemies to gore right before your very eyes. It would take a big push in the form of two of id's most fascinating pieces of developmental cannon fodder to push themselves to the standard they really wanted to shoot for. While Hovertank One wouldn't be the first release of the recently christened id Software, it's a remarkable jump towards a smoother ideation of both early Catacomb games' attempts at creating fast three-dimensional spaces. Emphasis on spaces. These are not the complex environments lovingly crafted to induce adrenaline just yet. Hovertank One is a very self-admittedly cut-and-dry attempt at making sure that Carmack could even make 3 dimensions a possibility on the weaker hardware of the early 90s home computer. All of the walls are various different colors, a simple illusion with enough trickery to simulate depth via slight discoloration. The main art effort that goes credited to id mainstay Adrian Carmack would only be a few splash screens and a couple of enemy sprites. In fact, the old id alumni doesn't take much time to reflect on their time with Hovertank, arguably less than Catacomb as a series. Hovertank's release is not much but a footnote in Masters of Doom, as its retrospective focuses much more on the tech rather than the game. Hell, even the recent Making Catacomb 3D documentary posted to John Romero's channel even passes by this game quickly, almost as if it was simply a stepping stone rather than a tangible, engaging experience. What gives? Judging by the studio's previous work, artistic limitation has never stopped the guys from making games with cute little gameplay loops. Trust me when I say this, but Hovertank 1 may be one of the few video games that I've ever played that I can confidently classify as genuinely antiquated. I hate when people level older forms of media as outdated or past their time, but my major point is simply, when was the last time you played a shooter without a mouse or a joystick? Sure, Catacomb, Wolfenstein, Doom, and Quake all have the option to abstain from mouse usage, but id shipped all of their games post-Catacomb 3D with bespoke mouse look features, and in the case of Catacomb, that game has a modern source port with Catacomb GL. Hovertank 1 has no such thing, sadly meaning that you need to lug your tank around with the arrow keys. Classic tank controls are a hot-button topic in gaming, a topic I think is completely overblown by a mainstream effort to make older games sound less appealing than they actually are, but I don't think they are appropriate for raw shooters, even the ones where you play as an actual tank. Rawness is what Hovertank is about, for better or worse, and I'm much more inclined to say that it is for the worst. I find the presentation absolutely adorable. Cheers and expletives voiced by Hall always get a laugh out of me between this and Rise of the Triad, but that's all you get. There seems to be a sense of directorial frustration otherwise, both between Hall and the player. You get the sense that Hall deeply wants this game to be a visual treat, and I'm stuck wondering how a series of green blocks and red blocks could even depict being a college campus without any of Catacomb's cuter signposts. It's just bad, from a primal sense. I know that motion sickness in shooters wasn't a discovered phenomenon until Wolfenstein 3D's release, but holy hell if I didn't want to blow chunks while looking at the thin window of my tank, passing by rainbow vomit walls. Slowly looking at Hovertank 1 becomes more of a mindfuck as time passes by, as everything sludges and contorts in a way that most first-person shooters don't. Either they avoid this gracefully or purposefully master macabre and abrasive coloring for artistic effect. Hovertank 1 isn't abrasive, it's just annoying in the deepest sense, and judging by id's perfectionist streak, it's not surprising that they don't think of this at all. But what about the game they still think about? The game that Romero continues to sell box sets for on his website. Catacomb 3D is often shrugged aside when talking about id's foray into first-person shooter action, but honestly I think it's their cutest endeavor by far. It's still far and away a traditional experience one would expect from id, but everything the team learned on Catacomb 2 and Hovertank 1 is applied here. Carmack and Romero truly marked down their thesis here, proving that you can make a devilishly fast game from a first-person perspective. The short runtime lends itself well to the game, as I think repeating the same textures, stylized mazes, flat world, and gameplay philosophies would get old and tiring fast both on the player and the devs. Subtle foreshadowing. Catacomb puts players in the shoes of Pet and Neverhill, combing through the catacomb to save his friend Grelminar. Simple stuff, but the gameplay was once mind-blowing. Today it serves as a simple diversion, with its playtime ranging from about an hour to a quick and easy 20 minutes, provided that a player skips the esoteric riddles and brute forces their way through the keep with quick saves and teleporters. Instead of designing the game around Hovertank 1's dual objective mission structure, save the people, kill the monsters, the majority of Everhill's adventure will be spent uncovering secret walls, killing fantasy creatures, and strafing between projectiles, and finding color-coded keys to open up color-coded doors, all while jamming out to a sick, singular MIDI track, the fundamental backbone of every game of theirs, and soon the rest of the world. The more esoteric elements of both id and shooter design are presented here, and they're interesting to boot. In Romero's documentary about the game, Hall says, quote, "The player had unlimited ammo, and yeah, we could have gathered energy, but what if they ran out? Like, how do they get more? There's a bunch of problems with that. This is the first time that you're trying to do this in 3D, sort of like the tank thing. It'll sort of limit you by how frequently you can do something. Then you can just make the monster stronger so they last a little bit longer." Unquote. The deliberate direction of Catacomb 3D is interesting when you do understand the more directionless nature of Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, and Quake. The callbacks to the teleporter-based level sequencing of the second Catacomb game are adorable, and making that part of the game dependent on player emergence is bold in a way that no id game really was until Quake 2, much longer after most of these guys had left the studio. The studio's iconic Dungeons & Dragons influence would be felt through Grelminar, and while Adrian Carmack and John Romero mistakenly refer to him as Nemesis in the documentary, Adrian admits that Grelminar was snagged from the other Carmack's friend's character from their campaign. Had this camaraderie not been a part of their daily life at id, the ambition to make a fast-paced shooter could have fallen apart without this web of talent connecting each other. Catacomb, unlike Hovertank 1, sadly, is deeply important in a way that not many other people talk about. I urge everyone to give Catacomb a spin and see what id took from this experience, while Hovertank 1 can be treated as a morbid curiosity. Such camaraderie carried the young guys to bolder visions, hamstrung by a nostalgic appeal of the hardcore of the past. Silas Warner's Castle Wolfenstein had such a profound effect on the team growing up that when Romero spitballed the idea of doing a three-dimensional adaptation of the game, the entire team met him with excitement. Wolfenstein 3D is the ultimate culmination of this work, and while Doom would take the ideas and abstraction of early shooters and run even further with them, Wolfenstein 3D is extremely important to the ultra-violent identity and fast-paced render tech that would carry the genre forward. Masters of Doom recalls a rather cute moment in the studio's infancy regarding the idea of Wolfenstein as an intellectual property. The title had been in IP limbo for quite a while, but they weren't satisfied with using it themselves until they got the approval of big ol' Silas Warner himself. Catching him at an Apple II convention in Kansas City, the bright young minds of id showed Warner their shiny new art directly inspired by his. He compliments the boys, of course, who wouldn't, and from here on out, id gains the confidence they need to usher in the next level of interactive art. Wolfenstein is not a complex game by any means, but its complexity as a piece of art is rather telling about the environment, humor, and ego of the team that worked on it. This was the time that id really started feeling like rock stars, like the world was watching them, as if their time in the spotlight wouldn't fade anytime soon. Every piece of work from here up to Doom 3 symbolizes that mindset. It is very much like a band. I could liken them to the Beach Boys or the Clash. Raunchy but loved, with an odd history with even weirder connections. Members would be replaced with members that wouldn't be fondly remembered or celebrated, and eventually the band would be turned into a brand indicative of a switch in the zeitgeist, playing catch-up rather than embodying their trailblazer spirit. Wolfenstein 3D is their breakout studio hit, the one that matters the most, but not the one that is remembered the most for its own qualities, but rather what it inscribed into the culture. I think it's about high time that we start talking about general gameplay loops. The goals of previous id games tend to be extremely simple, the ways of reaching them even simpler. Wolfenstein 3D is the first time that the studio made an innovative gameplay loop that still permeates in our modern-day objective design. While key hunts and health management were a given, everything else was free reign. Making a military first-person shooter is a different task from making a fantasy fireball perforation simulator. The enemies of Catacomb 3D and Hovertank 3D perform simple melee attacks against the player. Within modern understanding, it's known that as long as the player stays out of range, it's piss easy to mow down through hordes of enemies without any sort of friction. But this still wasn't like anything anyone had ever seen up to this point, so this is why both games opted to hide enemies behind walls, snug behind cover in order to catch a player off guard. Both games also have one enemy that will send out a projectile in order to pick off unsuspecting players at range. Tanks in Hovertank would blast away at players with little warning, to much annoyance, while mages in Catacomb would send out fireballs that the players could dodge, being a definite evolution in shooter design. We can split these attack types into three different variations: melee, hitscan, and projectile. While projectile attacks may have been appropriate for the fireballs, they don't seem well suited for gunfire. It capitalizes on this idea by making Wolf 3D a purely hit-scan-based shooter, while tacking some classic Wolfensteinisms to the combat loop. Stealth and exploration is tackled in a deliberately rudimentary and simple way. According to the Masters of Doom book, Romero made a fuss about the more bespoke, complex elements of the older games getting in the way of the team's new vision. Quote, "Ugh," Romero groaned as he watched Tom drag a body across the screen. "That's not going to help the game be badass. It's slowing the game down. It's a neat idea. But when you're running down hallways and blowing down everything you see, who cares if you drag shit? We gotta rip that code right out of there. Anything that's going to stop us from mowing shit down, get rid of it." Unquote. Now that you don't need to wait through pilfering and hiding bodies, picking up items and picking off enemies is effortless and fast, and players are taught immediately the parameters of both routes of survival. The nexus point of shooter design really does begin here. Gaze upon the body of the dead Nazi that soldier boy BJ Blazkowicz stabbed and looted, if you dare. Should you press forward, you'll find yourself at a fork in the road, left or right. Choosing right nets you a small reward, a 9mm magazine, and a freshly baked turkey lying on the ground. Following through at the left path, you open some doors, take in the primitive scenery, and finally come across your first guard. He doesn't notice you, yet, so you can either start blasting or take a much more cautious approach and position yourself in a way that you can cover up quickly should you need it. This is a dynamic height in a way that none of id's other games really ever reached at this point. There is a perceived flow state that one will enter when playing a shooter. Interacting with the art of the gun is ubiquitous with being one with the gun, and that started with a floating hand and Luger placed in the middle of players' screens that fateful day in May 1992. Pop, shoot, run, think, fight. There's no better primal feeling than that in video games. Wolfenstein nails what Hovertank failed at and engenders the kind of free-willed, fast gameplay that the Catacomb series took 3 games to fully realize. Describing this creed is absolutely the easiest part of this project, as the gameplay loop has been deeply ingrained into the cultural zeitgeist. The simplicity of shoot at it until it dies and don't let your health reach 0 is a common thread throughout violence as entertainment, and it's so interesting to see Patient Zero, the moment where we got it right. That first episode of Wolfenstein is one of the highest points of the game, with a ton to take away from. A painting to understand it as a company in the 90s, with the first episode being directed by Tom Hall, and the second episode would be designed by Romero, and the two would almost alternate between episodes during the development of the base game and the expansion, the Nocturnal missions. Reading through the official hint manual for Wolfenstein 3D, put out by the company, it's very apparent that the two creatives enjoyed bouncing off of each other, playing each other's levels, and inserting dry humor into the game in some genuinely abstract ways. id games are mean as hell. The hit-scan design of the soldiers already proves that, with able-bodied enemies able to tear through your flesh with ease. But that is honestly better exemplified through level design. The one joke that got a big laugh out of me lies in E2M5, in which you can enter a few doors and then boom, you're finished with the level. Obviously, there's more to the level if you wish to explore. Hall loved littering his levels with rewarding odds and ends, but if you didn't know that, then tough shit, it's on to the next level. The inverse is also true. Imagine traversing the entire level, filling out the entire swastika shape, only to realize that the exit was at the beginning of the mission the entire time. Oh well. Yet it's the joke featured in E4M7 that interests me the most from a design position. Up to this point, the colored keys never had dared to be placed behind secret walls, another piece of mechanical abstraction from the Bane of Hall, evolving into Catacomb's destructible walls. That changes here, way later into the game, and the mission pack only dedicated Wolfenstein players would touch. Fuck your logic, Hall says, breaking any semblance of cohesion up to this point, making it seem that things are going to be incredibly unpredictable going forward. This joke ruffles a lot of feathers. It's funny after the fact, but experiencing this level, especially blind, leads to a lot of frustration and headache. To be honest, it's emblematic of Wolfenstein 3D's biggest problem. Reaching back to my statement on Hovertank 1's antiquity, I find myself hard-pressed to say that Wolfenstein 3D is poorly aged, more or less that the ideas presented weren't really ever that great. I don't know if you can populate a game with 60 levels of maze-based exploration and combat without ever really breaking that mold outside of a few moments, and even then, those moments are infuriating too. Between Episode 4's experiments and the deliberate difficulty spike of Episode 6, stated to only be like that to knock Romero down a peg, the Nocturnal missions slow Wolfenstein down to a crawl, antithetical to the original intention. On top of getting bored of looking at the same walls, paintings, and untextured ceilings, it gets genuinely grating. The flow state is lost, resulting in a game that stops feeling good during Hall's moments of perceived friction. Romero's levels are better, as they always focus on the combat loop, but they're only as good as the combat allows them to be. I buried the lead here, but I do find purely hit-scan design rather insipid when it's broken down by simplistic, unintrusive design. To not be able to dodge, to stick in place while enemies flood at you creates a rather mushy combat loop. It's vapid. To be fair to id, this is not a combat loop they would ever fully dedicate themselves to ever again, with their games consisting of minimal types of hit scanners with mostly projectile and melee attacks from here on out. This is especially intrusive in Episode 2. Hit scan zombies. Mind you, they have no generous wind-up animation, like the rest of the guards do, which just makes them extremely irritating to fight. I bemoaned every single time I had to face them. They are just anti-fun. This isn't funny, it's just baffling and bland. Yet that's most of Wolfenstein. Simply bland. The flow state is broken up frequently by points of boredom and indifference. There's no reason to care about individual levels, arenas, or bits. This seemed to be the sentiment shared by id going into Spear of Destiny. According to Masters of Doom, quote, others in the office weren't quite as immersed, but everyone but Romero, it seems, was burned out of Wolfenstein. Adrian was tired of turning out realistic Nazi images, and he began hanging out more with Kevin, who was now collaborating with him. Tom, meanwhile, was getting increasingly frustrated with the design direction of the games. On occasion, he would pull Romero aside and ask when they were going to start working on the next Keen trilogy. Romero would tell him that it was still on the table, but privately, he was getting tired of the badgering. Tom was clearly not motivated to work on Spear. Unquote. That indifference is felt in Spear of Destiny tenfold. This is the most grating mission pack the original team had ever developed themselves. So many of the levels just repeat their core objective. Go here, then come back to a central hub, reposition yourself, go through another set of hallways positioned on a cardinal direction. Rinse, repeat. It's exhausting and hideous without much rhyme or reason for existing outside of mandate. Truly, the only thing Spear of Destiny gets right is the outlook it cements towards id, showcased in the ending. As BJ grabs the titular relic, he turns around, opens the door, only to find a warped, hellish version of the arena enveloping him. Demons and ghouls? Demons and ghouls indeed. Spear of Destiny gets brutally honest with its intent here. This is the last time id wants to touch Wolfenstein, and it would be the last time that id themselves would develop a game in the series, setting their sights on brighter lights, flashier experiences, and a real brutal masterpiece made by real rock stars. Thank you deeply for watching.